The church fell dead silent as the massive, scarred frontiersman slammed a heavy leather pouch of gold onto the pulpit. They had dragged her there as a cruel joke, the overweight spinster no man would touch. But Gideon didn't laugh. He looked at the snickering crowd, drew his hunting knife, and promised them hell. Oak Haven, Colorado Territory, was a town built on hard rock and even harder judgments. In the autumn of 1878, survival was the only currency that mattered to most. But social standing was a close second. For 24-year-old Clementine Caldwell, neither came easily. Clementine was a woman of considerable size. In a frontier town where women were expected to be frail, delicate creatures who fainted at the sight of blood, Clementine was solidly built, carrying the heavy weight of genetics and a sedentary life spent hidden away behind a sewing machine. She had a soft, round face, deep, expressive brown eyes, and hands that could stitch a wedding dress fit for royalty. Yet she had never been allowed to dream of wearing one herself. Her father, Amos Caldwell, was a bitter, debt-ridden man who viewed his daughter not as a child, but as a failed investment. "You eat more than a draft horse and bring in half the coin," he would sneer, counting the meager pennies she earned mending clothes for the town's elite. The elite, of course, were the ones who mocked her most viciously. Beatrice Higgins, the town's chief gossip and owner of the local mercantile, made it a point to loudly discuss how much fabric it took to clothe the Caldwell heifer whenever Clementine walked into the store. But the cruelest of them all was Jeremiah Finch. Jeremiah was the son of Oak Haven's only banker. He was slick, wealthy, and ruthless. Amos Caldwell owed the Finch family over $500, a staggering fortune at the time. When the debt came due that freezing November, Amos, in a fit of drunken desperation, offered Clementine as collateral, suggesting a marriage to Jeremiah to wipe the slate clean. Jeremiah didn't just refuse. He decided to make a public spectacle of it. He called a town meeting at the community church under the guise of an auction of assets. When the pews were packed with men chewing tobacco and women whispering behind lace fans, Jeremiah hauled a trembling, humiliated Clementine to the front. She wore her best dress, a dark navy cotton she had painstakingly tailored to flatter her heavy frame, but under the harsh glare of the congregation, she felt stripped bare. "Amos Caldwell here thinks his daughter is worth $500, Jeremiah announced, his voice echoing off the wooden rafters. The room erupted into immediate, cruel laughter. "I told him I'm in the banking business, not the livestock trade. Look at her. Who in their right mind would take on a burden this massive? She'd break the wagon axle before you ever got her to a homestead." Tears, hot and fast, pricked Clementine's eyes, but she bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, refusing to let them fall. She stared at the scuffed floorboards. "Just let it end," she prayed silently. "Let the floor open up and swallow me." "I'll give you $2 for her," shouted a drunk from the back row. "Need someone to keep the barn warm." "Careful, she might eat your winter rations," shrieked Beatrice Higgins. The laughter swelled into a deafening roar. Jeremiah strutted in front of the altar, soaking in the attention, preparing to deliver another punchline. Then, the heavy oak doors of the church slammed open. The laughter died instantly, choked off as if a collective noose had been pulled tight around Oak Haven's neck. Standing in the doorway, blocking out the afternoon sun, was Gideon Hayes. Gideon was a myth made flesh. He lived alone near the jagged peaks of Whisper Ridge, only coming down twice a year for supplies. He stood 6'4", broad-shouldered and heavily muscled, wearing a thick wolf pelt coat and a low-brimmed hat. A brutal scar jagged down the left side of his face, a souvenir from a grizzly bear that hadn't survived the encounter. But it wasn't just his lethal appearance that made the town fear and shun him. It was his secret. Years ago, the town's physician, Dr. Abernathy, had treated Gideon for a severe bout of mountain fever. The fever had burned so hot it nearly killed him, and Abernathy, a man who couldn't hold his liquor or his tongue, had widely broadcasted the aftermath. Gideon Hayes was sterile. The mountain man would never sire a child. In a society that valued a man by the sons he could produce to work the land, Gideon was considered fundamentally broken, a dead end. A ghost. Gideon walked down the center aisle. His heavy boots thudded against the wood like a ticking clock. The crowd parted, shrinking back into the pews. He didn't look at Jeremiah, nor did he look at Amos. His piercing gray eyes were locked entirely on Clementine. He stopped at the altar. Jeremiah, trying to muster his arrogance, puffed out his chest. "Hayes, you're tracking mud into the Lord's house. What do you want?" Gideon ignored him. He reached inside his heavy coat, pulled out a thick, stained leather pouch, and slammed it onto the pulpit. The heavy clink of solid gold echoed in the dead silence. $500. Gideon's voice was like grinding stones, deep, rough, and entirely devoid of amusement. "In raw nugget." Weighed and verified. Amos Caldwell's jaw dropped. "You're paying my debt?" "I'm buying the right to marry your daughter," Gideon corrected, turning his massive frame to look down at Amos. "And taking her far away from the lot of you." Jeremiah let out a nervous, high-pitched scoff. "You? Marrying her? Well, I suppose it's fitting. The barren mountain freak and the fat, ugly seamstress. You won't ever have kids, but at least she can keep you fed, assuming she doesn't eat the food first." Gideon moved faster than a man his size had any right to. In a flash of silver, he drew his hunting knife and slammed it backward, burying the 8-inch blade deep into the wooden altar, mere millimeters from Jeremiah's hand. Jeremiah screamed and stumbled backward, tripping over his own boots and falling flat on his back. Gideon leaned over the altar, his scarred face inches from Jeremiah's pale, terrified one. "You speak another word about my wife," Gideon whispered, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear, "and I will carve out your tongue and feed it to my dogs. Nod if you understand." Jeremiah nodded frantically, scrambling backward like a crab. Gideon pulled the knife from the wood, sheathed it, and finally turned to Clementine. She was shaking, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She expected to see pity in his eyes, or perhaps the cold appraisal of a man buying property. Instead, she saw something she had never experienced in her entire life: respect. He slowly extended a calloused, massive hand toward her. "Miss Caldwell," Gideon said softly, the rough edge of his voice gentling, "if you'd rather stay here, I'll take my gold and go. But if you come with me, I swear on my life, no one in this town will ever disrespect you again." Clementine looked at the terrified faces of the people who had tormented her. She looked at her father, who was already reaching greedily for the gold. Then she looked at the scarred hand of the giant standing before her. Without a word, she reached out and placed her soft, trembling hand in his. The journey up to Whisper Ridge took 3 grueling days. By the time Oak Haven was nothing more than a dusty smudge in the valley below, Clementine's entire body ached. The mountain air was dangerously thin, and the trail was little more than a jagged ribbon of loose shale and frozen mud. She rode a sturdy, wide-backed draft horse Gideon had brought specifically for the trip, while he walked ahead, leading his pack mules. Clementine was terrified that her weight was torturing the animal. Every time the horse stumbled, she gasped, apologizing to the beast and bracing herself for Gideon's reprimand. She was used to men complaining about the space she took up, the burden she represented, but Gideon never complained. Whenever the trail grew dangerously steep, he stopped, wordlessly helped her down, and walked beside her. When she fell behind, gasping for breath, her chest burning from the altitude and exertion, he didn't roll his eyes or sigh. He simply stopped, unpacked his canteen, and handed it to her, waiting with his back turned to give her the dignity of catching her breath without an audience. On the 3rd evening, as a bitter wind began to howl through the evergreens, they crested the final ridge. Clementine stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth falling open. She had expected a squalid, drafty shack, a hole in the dirt for a feral mountain man. What she saw instead was a beautifully constructed 2-story log cabin nestled into the side of the mountain. The logs were hand-hewn and perfectly fitted, caulked with meticulous care. Smoke curled invitingly from a solid stone chimney. Out back, A well-built barn and a sturdy corral held a few head of cattle and goats. It wasn't a shack. It was a fortress. It was a home. Gideon unlatched the heavy timber door and gestured for her to enter. Clementine stepped inside and was instantly hit by the smell of cedar, wood smoke, and dried lavender. The floors were polished pine, covered in thick, soft animal rugs. A massive iron stove sat in the kitchen area, and the shelves were lined with neatly labeled jars of preserves, dried meats, and herbs. "It's beautiful," she whispered, genuinely stunned. Gideon took her heavy wool coat, hanging it on a peg near the door. "Built it myself," he muttered, keeping his back to her as he stoked the fire. "It's drafty in the winter if you don't keep the stove fed, but it holds strong against the wind." That night, an awkward, heavy silence settled between them. Gideon cooked a simple but hearty stew of venison and root vegetables. When he set a massive bowl in front of her, Clementine instinctively pushed it half away. "I shouldn't," she murmured, staring at the table. "I don't need this much." Gideon stopped eating. He looked at her, his brow furrowing. "You walked 5 miles up a 40-degree incline today. You need the fuel," my father said. "Your father is a fool who sold his own flesh and blood for a handful of rocks," Gideon interrupted, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He softened his tone immediately when he saw her flinch. "Clementine, look at me." She slowly raised her eyes. "You are not in Oakhaven anymore," he said firmly. "Up here, a body needs strength. I don't care about what those frail, corset-wearing women down in the valley look like. They'd last 3 days up here before the mountain broke them. Eat your food." For the first time in her life, Clementine ate until she was actually full, and no one glared at her with disgust. After dinner, as the wind rattled the heavy window shutters, Gideon sat in a leather armchair across from the hearth, sharpening an axe with a whetstone. Clementine sat nervously on the edge of the large, sturdy bed in the corner of the room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She knew what a wedding night entailed. She was terrified of what he would expect, of how he would react when he truly saw her size without the thick layers of wool. Gideon stopped the rhythmic scraping of the stone. He didn't look up, but he spoke clearly into the quiet room. "I know what Dr. Abernathy told the town," Gideon said, his voice stripped of emotion, hollowed out by years of shame. "I know what they call me, the barren man, the dead branch." Clementine gripped her dress. "Mr. Hayes." "Gideon," he corrected. He finally looked up, his scarred face illuminated by the flickering firelight. "I bought your contract because I saw how they looked at you. I know that look. I've lived with that look since the fever took my future away. But I need you to know the truth before anything else happens between us." He set the axe down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I cannot give you children, Clementine. The fever burned it all out of me. If babies are what you want, I have done you a terrible wrong by taking you from that town. I needed a partner, I needed a wife, but I can only offer you me and this mountain." Clementine stared at him. The man who had terrified an entire church was sitting before her, practically offering his neck, exposing his deepest, most agonizing insecurity. Slowly, Clementine stood up. She walked over to the fire, the floorboards creaking under her weight, and stood in front of him. "Gideon," she said, her voice shaking but resolute, "do you know why I didn't fight when you took my hand?" He shook his head slowly. "Because down there I am a monster," she whispered, tears finally breaking free and spilling down her round cheeks. "They look at my body and they see gluttony. They see laziness. They don't see that my father starved me for days as punishment, and my body held on to every ounce of fat it could just to survive. They don't see me. If we had stayed down there, I would have died an old, mocked spinster, or I would have killed myself to escape it." She reached out, hesitantly, and touched his scarred cheek. He closed his eyes, leaning into her soft palm. "I don't need a house full of children to be a mother," Clementine said softly. "I need a man who sees me as a human being. If you can give me that, Gideon Hayes, I will be the best wife this mountain has ever seen." He opened his eyes, and for the first time, the cold, hard frontiersman looked entirely undone. He reached up, covering her soft, plump hand with his massive, calloused one. Before he could speak, a sound ripped through the night, a sound that froze the blood in Clementine's veins. It was a scream, but not human. It was a high-pitched, guttural shriek coming from the darkness outside, followed immediately by the panicked thrashing of the draft horse in the barn. Gideon was on his feet in a microsecond, the tender moment shattering like glass. He grabbed a heavy Winchester rifle from above the mantel and threw his coat over his shoulders. "Cougar!" Gideon snarled, his eyes turning to chips of ice. "It's inside the barn. Lock the door behind me and do not open it, no matter what you hear." He threw open the door and vanished into the howling blizzard. Clementine rushed to the door, slamming the heavy iron bolt into place. Her heart pounded in her throat. She stood by the window, peering through a small crack in the frost-covered glass. The wind was whipping the snow into a blinding frenzy. She could barely see the outline of the barn 50 yards away. Bang! The gunshot echoed over the wind. Then, a horrifying roar of pain, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Clementine waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The storm raged outside, but there were no more gunshots, no footsteps returning to the porch. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her chest. If Gideon was dead, she was entirely alone on a frozen mountain, miles from civilization. She looked at the heavy iron fireplace poker resting by the hearth. She remembered Jeremiah Finch's mocking voice. She'd break the wagon axle. A burden this massive. Clementine set her jaw. She was not a burden. Not anymore. She grabbed the heavy iron poker, wrapped a thick wool shawl around her head and shoulders, and threw open the cabin door, stepping out into the blinding, freezing nightmare of Whisper Ridge. The wind howled like a choir of the damned as Clementine pushed her way through the knee-deep snow. The cold was an immediate, physical blow, biting through her wool dress and stinging her skin like glass. She could barely see the massive, dark shape of the barn ahead, but she kept moving, using her heavy frame to break through the snowdrifts that would have halted a smaller woman. She gripped the cold iron poker so tightly her knuckles ached. As she neared the heavy barn doors, the thrashing of the horse had ceased. The silence that replaced it was infinitely more terrifying. Clementine pressed her shoulder against the wood and pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. The heavy scent of copper, wet fur, and sulfur hit her instantly. The barn was dimly lit by a single, overturned lantern sputtering in the dirt. But the scene illuminated by that flickering light made her breath hitch. There was a cougar, a massive, emaciated mountain lion, lying dead in the center aisle, a clean bullet hole through its skull. But it wasn't the beast that had taken Gideon down. Gideon was slumped against a wooden support pillar, bleeding heavily from a gunshot wound to his shoulder. Standing over him were not wild animals, but 3 men. Clementine recognized the expensive fur-lined coat immediately. It was Jeremiah Finch. Beside him stood 2 rough-looking hired guns from Oakhaven, their revolvers drawn. "I told you, Hayes," Jeremiah sneered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and arrogant adrenaline. "Nobody humiliates me in front of my town and gets away with it. You thought you could just buy the fat cow, make a fool out of me, and hide up here on your mountain? You're trespassing, Finch," Gideon ground out, his voice weak but laced with pure venom. He was holding his bleeding shoulder, his rifle kicked out of reach. "I came for my gold," Jeremiah spat, kicking Gideon's boot. "And I'm taking it back. We followed your tracks. Figured we'd ambush you in your sleep, but leaving the barn door open to let that cat in did the work for us. Kept you distracted. Now, tell me where the rest of your stash is, or I'll put a bullet in your good knee." Clementine stood in the shadows, her blood turning to ice. They had followed them. They were going to kill Gideon, steal his gold, and then she shuddered to think what they would do to her. She was a witness. She was the woman who had publicly rejected Jeremiah. She'd break the wagon axle before you ever got her to a homestead. Jeremiah's cruel words echoed in her mind. All her life, she had been told she took up too much space, that she was too heavy, too solid, too burdensome. Clementine looked at the heavy iron poker in her hands. She looked at the three men with their backs turned to her, entirely focused on the wounded giant on the floor. She didn't shrink away. She didn't try to hide. For the first time in 24 years, Clementine Caldwell decided to use every single pound the good Lord had given her. With a fierce, guttural battle cry that echoed off the high rafters, Clementine charged. She didn't stumble. She hit the nearest hired gun like a runaway freight train. The sheer velocity and weight behind her solid frame sent the man flying through the air. He crashed headfirst into the heavy wooden stall door, unconscious before he even hit the hay-strewn floor. Jeremiah and the second thug spun around in shock, raising their guns. But Clementine was already moving. She swung the heavy iron poker with a terrifying, desperate strength. The iron cracked against the second thug's wrist with a sickening snap. He screamed, dropping his revolver, and Clementine drove her shoulder into his chest, pinning him brutally against the stone wall of the barn, until all the air rushed out of his lungs and he crumpled. Jeremiah Finch stumbled backward, his face drained of all color, his pistol shaking wildly in his manicured hand. "Stay back, you crazy heifer!" Clementine didn't stop. She marched toward him, the bloody iron poker gripped in both hands, her eyes burning with a lifetime of repressed fury. Jeremiah fired. The bullet grazed the thick wool of her shawl, but she didn't even flinch. Before he could cock the hammer again, Clementine swung the iron poker upward, knocking the gun from his hand. Then, she grabbed the lapels of his expensive coat, lifted him onto his toes, and threw him backward into an empty horse trough. Jeremiah scrambled, gasping for air, but Clementine planted her heavy boot firmly onto his chest, pressing him down into the frozen wood. She raised the heavy iron poker above his face. "You call me a cow again, Jeremiah," Clementine whispered, her chest heaving. "And I will show you how hard I can trample." Jeremiah whimpered, squeezing his eyes shut and raising his hands in absolute surrender. A low, rich sound broke the tension. Clementine turned her head. Gideon was still bleeding against the pillar, but he was laughing. It was a deep, chest-rattling chuckle of pure amazement. He looked at the unconscious thugs, the terrified banker, and then up at his wife, standing like an avenging angel in the dim light. "Remind me," Gideon wheezed, a fierce, loving smile breaking through his scarred face, "to never, ever cross you, Mrs. Hayes." Clementine tied the three men together using thick, coarse baling rope, securing them to the central support beam so tightly they could barely breathe. Then, she practically carried Gideon back to the cabin. For 3 days the blizzard raged, trapping them all. Clementine proved her worth 100 times over, digging out the bullet with sterilized forceps, stitching Gideon's shoulder with the steady, precise hands of a master seamstress, and keeping the fires burning hot. When the storm finally broke, Gideon was stable enough to hold a shotgun on their prisoners while Clementine hitched the draft horse to the wagon. They didn't just dump the men in the wilderness. They drove them straight down the mountain, right into the heart of Oakhaven. The town stopped dead when the wagon rolled down Main Street. Whispers erupted as the townsfolk saw Jeremiah Finch, their wealthy, untouchable elite, bound, bruised, and shivering in the back of a wagon, alongside 2 known criminals. But what shocked them more was the woman driving the wagon. Clementine sat tall, wrapped in a magnificent, thick grizzly bear coat Gideon had made for her. The mountain air had put a flush in her cheeks, and the way she held the reins spoke of unyielding confidence. She was still a large woman, but there was nothing soft or timid about her anymore. She carried her weight with pride, radiating a dangerous, undeniable strength. Gideon handed the prisoners over to the local authorities, but they demanded federal intervention. To ensure justice wasn't bought by the Finch family's bank, Gideon telegraphed Sheriff David Cook of the real-life Rocky Mountain Detective Association in Denver. Cook, a legendary lawman known for his incorruptible nature, rode into Oakhaven personally to arrest Jeremiah Finch for attempted murder and armed robbery. Jeremiah's father, disgraced and facing the collapse of his bank, fled the territory. Amos Caldwell, terrified that his daughter would turn her wrath on him next, was never seen in the saloon again. Oakhaven learned a harsh, permanent lesson that day. You do not mock a woman forged in fire, and you certainly don't trespass on Gideon Hayes's mountain. Years passed, and Whisper Ridge blossomed into a sprawling, successful ranch. Clementine and Gideon built an empire of cattle and timber, their bond forged in the ironclad respect of that first winter. But their greatest legacy was not their wealth. Knowing Gideon could not father children, Clementine suggested they look eastward. In the late 1880s, the orphan trains from New York began arriving in the West, carrying thousands of abandoned children seeking homes. Clementine and Gideon took the train to Denver. They didn't choose the strongest boys to work the fields, nor the prettiest girls to dress up. They chose the children who were huddled in the corners, the ones deemed too loud, too quiet, too scarred, or too heavy. The ones the rest of society had looked at and judged as broken. Over the next 20 years, the barren mountain man and his too-fat bride legally adopted and raised 12 children. The Hayes Ranch became a haven, echoing with the laughter of a massive, unconventional, and fiercely loyal family. When Gideon eventually passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 81, he died, holding the hand of the woman who had saved his life, surrounded by a dozen sons and daughters who loved him as their own. Clementine outlived him by a decade, ruling the mountain as its beloved matriarch, forever proving that a person's true worth is never measured by the space they take up, but by the size of the heart beating within it. If you were moved by Clementine and Gideon's incredible journey of survival, justice, and finding true love against all odds, please click the like button and share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas, thrilling Western histories, and emotional stories every single week. Drop a comment below on what part of their revenge satisfied you the most.